Hello class, today we are looking at David Hume, and David Hume was a Scottish philosopher who was born in the 18th century, and he's also an empiricist. So this word empiricism is something to consider in terms of the way in which we're understanding things philosophically by way of perception. And so here we have the way in which we're understanding knowledge perceptually for David Hume, and by extension, the way in which we're understanding morality for Hume, or ethics for Hume. And so Hume was born in 1711 and dies in 1776, and we're reading an excerpt from his book, A Treatise on Human Nature, and the Treatise on Human Nature is a way in which Hume covers a lot of ground, ranging from his celebrated empirical positions on causation, and of course the whole work is an in-depth study of the basis of how it is that we know things, extending to a foundation for how it is that we're justifying or grounding morality for Hume on empirical grounds. So our excerpt is having to do with the morality, obviously with morality, and Hume's empiricist grounding for morality. And so once again, in his opening abstract, Hume makes a point of how to understand his use of impressions and ideas, whereby we must recognize that as an empiricist, Hume wishes to emphasize that he is working in contrast to the rationalists. So the rationalists, or rationalist philosophers, base the way in which we understand knowledge on a rational grounding, whereas Hume is working to, and also the rationalists ground morality in reason and etc. Whereas with Hume, the way in which we are understanding anything, knowledge, morality, so on and so forth, is by way of perception, i.e. our five senses. And so any knowledge of the world is known perceptually. And our initial perception for Hume is termed as an impression. So we have impressions, and our impressions are ways in which we perceive the world initially. And then for Hume, we also have ideas. And so ideas are simply agglomerations or combinations of all the perceptual impressions we have of the world. And so any and all initial sense impressions are what make up the agglomeration of ideas that we have. So what's important here to recognize in terms of understanding a feature of his moral theory is that reason itself is, in Hume's context, to be classified as an idea. And so reason is also understood by Hume to be a relation of ideas. And so all of this is to imply his philosophical context, indeed Hume's place in philosophical history, in that Hume is skeptical of basing both knowledge and morality in general on a rationalist grounding. Okay? So that's really the crux of what you want to understand here, is that even though he is not basing morality on reason itself or rational means, he still is not casting reason out and seeing it as not important. He's really seeing it as not important as the grounding. So what we want to at least hold on to there is that reason is a way in which we are understanding things that follows emotion. And so right away, Hume launches into his position that given that we only have perceptions by which we base any of our ideas and our morality, This is all based on sensory impressions, and also within Hume's context, the word passions is to be understood as emotions. And likewise, he uses the word sentiments or affect. So anytime we hear the word or read the word sentiment or affect, passion, that's to entail for Hume a reference to our emotional standpoint. And the thing to also get a grasp of is that the way in which we're understanding things emotionally is likewise perceptual. So in other words, the way in which we perceive the world is not only by the senses, but also by way of our emotional feelings for things. And this is what is the grounding for morality for Hume. So, to be clear, although Hume is demoting the place of reason in our regarding of morality's grounding, Hume is not, as we might assume, as we just pointed out, rejecting reason altogether. Rather, he sees reason as 1, the discovery of truth and falsehood, 2, the determining of matters of fact, and 3, more broadly, reason is simply a relation of ideas. So, emotion is antecedent to morality. In other words, we are considering emotion as the basis for morality, and it is the grounding, okay? So rather than the rationalist position that all morality has its basis in reason and our innately rational ability, okay? So this is something that a rationalist would point out, and that Hume is skeptical of that particular rationalist grounding. So he also identifies reason as the way in which we know what we're passionate about or what we're emotional about. Yet, again, reason is not the basis for morality. And so that's the take-home there. It's just simply a relation of ideas. So when Hume writes that reason is wholly inactive, he specifically means that reason is inactive as a source for the basis of morality and ethics. So even if we can discern matters of fact in terms of morality by way of reason, we must not, for Hume, see this as the source of morality, or we must not see rationality as the source of morality itself. Okay? So as Hume writes, we use reason to determine what we're emotional about, and even what is causing our passion and our emotion, but yet we are not seeing it as a grounding, okay? Yet reason is not the source of morality for Hume. And in other words, a mistaken fact is a lapse of reason, and so such mistakes of reason cannot be said to be the grounding for morality. So like, for example, mistaking a rotten apple for a ripe apple is not necessarily a moral failure. Lapses of reason are not the basis or foundation of morality, and likewise mere relations of ideas cannot be said to be the grounding either, or the grounding of morality. So Hume likewise concludes that the source of morality cannot be traced to matters of fact, and likewise to objects in and of themselves. And so here we get the most obvious source of morality for Hume that is grounded in sentiment, as we're hammering in here. So in other words, ingratitude toward one's parents is not a factual error. The morality is more founded in the sentiment. So the problem is in the feelings we're having, not in the factual accounting of it, as we usually misperceive. So otherwise known as our emotional intuitions, responses, and reactions, to be seen as the basis there of morality. So really, we have the job of distinguishing a few more key points concerning his excerpt of human nature. So the source of morality cannot be derived in facts alone, okay, which is a point that we have a problem with because we usually think that the way in which we understand facts is the basis for everything. And what we're wanting to dislodge ourselves of is this notion that facts are the most important thing we could consider. Whereas here, what Hume is pointing out is that what's more important to consider in terms of morality has to do with feelings. Now, on this point too, we need to recognize that because of that claim, that does not automatically make Hume a relativist or what we could call a subjectivist. And so students often want to make that consideration that just because he's basing morality on emotion, that he is therefore a subjectivist or a relativist, and that he is not. Because we do share common ways in which we emotionally are understanding or feeling morality. And there are common threads there that we need to recognize as not always subjective or not subjectively understood in our common sense of subjectivity as linked to relativism. Okay? So the source of morality cannot be derived from facts alone, and so what is the case should not be confused with what ought to be the case. And so purely on perceptual grounds, okay, or purely on factual grounds. We cannot base morality purely on factual grounds is the point, okay, even though we are tempted to do so. So when we're identifying the is-ought problem, we want to recognize, number one, that it's a problem, and number two, the problem has to do with the confusion between what is the case, and what is the case has to do with facts, figures, and also a scientific way in which we know about the world. Those ways in which we know about the world factually should not be confused with what we ought to do. And so once I lay that out, you need to recognize that this is a very common problem we have because we usually want to do this. So when we're taking into account how it is that we're understanding things morally, moral problems in our world, we usually want to do this in a factual way by, say, for example, gathering data, so on and so forth. But what we're misunderstanding there is that the data and the scientific investigation is not the grounding for morality itself. So that's the point that we want to hold on to there, is that we shouldn't confuse the way in which we understand facts for the grounding of our ethical lives. So this is the legendary is-ought problem. That is to suggest for Hume that there's no way, as he sees it, to derive morality strictly by way of perceptual evidence that is outside of our emotional understanding. Okay? So his point here must not be taken lightly in the sense that morality cannot be sourced in facts alone or data alone. Likewise by way of scientific investigation. So given that Hume sources morality on sentiments and emotion, okay? So for instance, Hume offers the example of an elm or oak sapling, a young tree, that overtakes its parent tree, is not to be accused of the crime of parricide. Parricide just means parent killer. So we might do so jokingly or with some humor that, look, that little tree there killed its parent tree, but we don't do so in a way that we would for people. In other words, if a person killed their parent, it would be a whole different matter, apart from how it is that we consider things, facts, animals, nature that is outside of our emotional scope, so on and so forth. So for Hume, we cannot derive or find what we ought to do, what we should do ethically, from what is the case scientifically. Okay? So again, problem is we usually think that the only show in town is scientific investigation, and what we're learning here is that our perceptual and our emotional way in which we feel about things is an important grounding for morality that we usually don't consider. That's why he's referred to as a sentimentalist. And so this point we've already established, in that morality cannot be founded on reason and rationality alone. And we want to extend this part, and we won't extend this part anymore here beyond what we've already covered. And so then there's the more obscure yet critical point whereby Hume positions the place of nature. So there we have to understand how it is that we have these broad general views of the way in which we understand nature. And one way that we understand nature is as outside of us, and likewise a way in which we understand nature factually and scientifically. And that is something that we shouldn't confuse with the grounding for our morality, because we also have a way in which we understand nature as the way in which we're understanding our own perceptions and our emotions. In other words, our perceptions and our emotions, for Hume, are natural to us. So this is a way in which we understand nature, okay? But we shouldn't confuse it with this extrinsic way in which we perceive nature. And likewise, we shouldn't confuse the two. So when we confuse the two, we're committing the is-ought problem, and we need to dislodge ourselves from that to not mistake facts alone as the basis for morality. So one of the points that we want to think of here is a quote of David Hume's, which is that reason is a slave to the passions. So he wrote that reason is a slave to the passions, and this point is interesting because if he's suggesting that reason is a slave to the passions, that's showing us that he's not dispensing of reason. He's really just pointing out that reason follows the way in which we are passionate or emotional about things, and that's what's important to recognize. Because, as we've been pointing out, emotion, perception, sentiments are the way in which Hume is grounding morality and not casting out reason, but really just suggesting that reason is a way in which we follow up on the way in which we are emotionally feeling things, okay, or perceiving things. And I think that's good enough, so thank you. We'll talk more about this in class, and